First things first, let's create a geometry node. Going to call this curve Advection. Let's dive inside. We are going to start off by creating the curves that we are going to be advecting. So let's use a circle for this with 64 divisions and set this to open arc. And we can also use a fuse node just to wield these points together. And I'm going to use a copy and transform node. A really cool trick with this node is you can take this total number here, do a copy parameter, and in the rotate y here, going to see, say, 360 divided by the relative reference of that parameter. And if we do this and start increasing the total number, we can see that we always complete an entire circle with our copies, regardless of how many copies we have. So let's maybe do 11 copies. And I'm also going to scale this down on the y-axis. So I'll use a transform node. Now I would like to press Shift and 3 to get the side view, and I'm going to split these curves along the middle. So let's press S to get into selection mode, and I'll go to press N, and I'll use the knife tool for this. And I have grid snapping turned on. If I press X and I choose the grid here, and I'll just draw a line through the curves. And if I use the facet node, set to unique points, we can confirm that these are now split into individual curves. Let's output this with a null node. And I now want to create the smoke simulation that's going to be moving these curves around. So I'll just use a preset for this. Let's use the pyro configure billowy smoke here. But instead of using a torus, I'll just use a sphere. And let's turn off the pre-process here and adjust the parameters for the noise. Something like this seemed to work well for me. Let's try to play this sim. We can see we have a lot of directional movement, and that's coming from the wind inside of the shape here. So let's just turn off the wind. We also don't need disturbance. And I'll set the buoyancy to 0.01. And inside of the sourcing tab here, I'm just going to press this limit source range. Only make the smoke source for the first second. And let's also turn off the cycle length. So this is what we have now. And I just realized I made a mistake. We're supposed to set the element size to 0.5 and the offset to 50. So if we play this again, we have something like this. And this is going to be good to advect our smoke. So let's just delete the pyrobake volume. In the output, I'll turn off everything we do not need. And I'll also convert this to a VDB. Now I'm going to create a popnet. Let's wire the curves in the first input and the smoke in the second input. We can dive inside. In the pop source here, first thing, let's set emission type to all geometry. And I also want to limit this sourcing here to be only for the first 4 seconds. So let's set an expression for that. And let's also create the pop advect by volumes node. Make sure this is set to second context geometry, and I'll use update velocity set to trace midpoint. We can now play this, see what happens. And we have something. A trick we can do for this is actually just use a SOP solver here, dive inside, and we can tell the sim to just resample those curves every time step. So let's create a resample node here, and in the length, I'll set this to 0.005 and make sure this is set to subdivision curves to get them looking smooth. Dive back up And let's play the sim. And this is what we have. Also going to turn on the real-time playback down here. And the first issue I'm noticing with this is that the sim is taking a long time to sim, and the reason for this is that our initial curves are actually too long. So before the knife node here, I'll just use 2 clip nodes just to separate these curves into even shorter pieces. So for the first one, I'll use a value of 0.0119. And let's use another clip node with this set to a positive value. Just remove the minus here and set this keep here to below the plane. And now if I try to resim this, should be a bit faster. Now inside of our pop network, if we're not going to use any collisions, it's best to just turn off this add hit attributes. Just removes a bunch of attributes we do not need. And let's also do an attribute delete post sim. Set this to delete non-selected. The only attributes we need are going to be the age and the life attribute. And I'll also use a group delete. And set this to delete all groups by putting a star in the group names. Now to color these curves, I'll use a point swap. Dive inside, and I'll drive a random value from the primnum and a ramp from this. That's going to be the color. Let's also play the sim a bit. And I'll dive back up. And let's give these some red colors. Something like this. And that's basically everything. So we can output this with a null node. Call this render curves. And we are ready to render this. Before we create the camera and the materials, let's just dive back up and create a background for this scene. So I'm going to create a new geometry node and name this backdrop. Going to dive inside. Let's make a grid, 20 by 20. And I'm going to transform this to be behind our curves. Like this. And let's give this some UVs. And I'm going to output this with a null node. Let's dive back up, and I'll create a camera. Again, I'll just paste the values that I was using in the original project. Something like this, and I'll also create a material network to create the materials. Let's call this materials. Dive inside. Let's create the curve material. I'm going to do a RS material builder. And I'll set the base color to 1 by 1 by 1. And let's import our color that we specified with the point swap earlier. So use the point attribute lookup node and just pipe that into the base color here. And I'll also adjust the roughness and the reflection to 0.5. And I also did some slight subsurface scattering in this shader. So let's set this to 0.25 with a scale of 0.1. And that's basically everything. So let's copy this shader and assign it to the curves, like such. And while we are here, let's just come into this Redshift OBJ here and into the Strands tab and check this Render Objects as Strands. And I'm going to set the default scale to be 0.002. And you have to do this if you want to render curves in Redshift. Now for the backdrop material, let's go back into our materials here. create another material builder, dive inside, and all I'm going to do is just delete this shader. Let's create an RS ramp node, pipe that into the surface here, and in the settings, let's set the mapping to diagonal, and I'm going to set this first color here to be something like this, and the first color is going to be just a dark red like this. Let's also assign this to the background we have like such, and let's turn off our lock icon here so we don't move our camera, and I'm going to create a RS light, just going to be our key light. And let's take this light and drag it into the viewport so we can move it. And I'll press the lock icon here again. Find a nice top angle like such. And again, I'm going to use the same values that I was using in the main project. Something like this for the transform. And for the light tab here, let's increase the size a bit. And I'll set the exposure to 1. I also created a rim light for the final render, so let's do a new RS light and call it rim. Again, I'm going to drag this into the viewport so we can move it around, and let's find an angle from below. Something like this. I'll set the values from the original project again. And inside of the light tab here, I'm going to set the intensity to 1, and I'm going to make this a complementary color to these red curves. So something green, perhaps, something like this. And I'm also going to make this into a disk and increase the size by a lot. Again, turn off the lock, and let's come into our camera, and let's try to render this. So I have this Redshift render view here open. Let's press play. And this is everything I did for the render setup.